Okay, welcome everyone. It's our pleasure to have Dr. Saddiya join us. Saddiya Shaikh is a professor in the study of religions at the University of Cape Town. She specializes in the study of Islam, gender ethics, and feminist theory with a special interest in Sufism. Her study of Islam began with an abiding interest in existential questions, as well as a commitment to social justice. Much of her work is animated by an interest and curiosity about the relationship between the realms of the spiritual and the political. She has published on interpretations of the Quran, Hadith, and Sufi texts, Islamic feminism, religions and gender-based violence, Sufism and Islamic law, contemporary Muslim women's embodied ethics, and marriage, sexuality, and reproductive choices amongst South African Muslim women. She's the author of Sufi Narratives of Intimacy, Ibn Arabi, Gender and Sexuality, 2012, and co-author and editor of the Women's Khutbah book, Contemporary Sermons on Spirituality and Justice from Around the World, 2022. In her current work on ethics and Sufism, as well as in her own spiritual life, Saddiya draws on the inspiration, transmission, and teachings of a number of contemporary Sufi teachers, including Shaykh Muhammad Rahim Bawa Muhyiddin, Rahmatullahi alayhi, Shaykha Simal Nur Sargut, Shaykh Fadlallah Hayri, and Shaykha Fawziya Arawi. So, Professor Saddiya, please, when you're ready, go ahead. Do you need to do any sharing of the screen?
No.
No, that's great. Okay, everyone, we will listen to about 30 to 40 minutes of Dr. Saddiya speak, and after that we'll have a Q&A, and I'll be directing you to how you can put your hands up and so on at that time. Thank you very much. Please go ahead, Dr. Saddiya.
Hi, good morning. Assalamu alaikum. And thank you, Frank, for this introduction. And thank you to the group for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to begin my talk. I mean, you probably have read the excerpt or the abstract, and the title of the talk is The Mohammedan Light, Spirituality, Ethics, and Muslim Masculinities. So I'd like to start this reflection with a famous description of the Prophet ﷺ transmitted from a woman called Ma'bud. And this is how the description of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ reads. I saw a man, pure and clean, with a handsome face and a fine figure. He was graceful and elegant, with intensely black eyes and thick eyelashes. There was a huskiness in his voice, his beard was thick, and his eyebrows were finely arched and joined together. When silent, he was grave and dignified, and when he spoke, glory rose up and overcame him. He was from afar the most beautiful of men, and from close up he was the sweetest and the loveliest. He was sweet of speech and articulate, but not petty or trifling. His speech was a string of cascading pearls, measured so that none despaired of its length, and no eye challenged him because of brevity. In company, he is like a branch between two other branches, but is the most flourishing of the three in appearance, and the loveliest in power. He has friends surrounding him who listen to his words. If he commands, they oblige implicitly, with eagerness and with haste, without frown or complaint. Unquote. I begin with this description simply because I want to invite us to all revel in the beautiful fragrance of this depiction of the beloved Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Today, I want to draw on the Tasawwuf tradition, and more especially some contributions from Ibn Arabi, to reflect on the understandings of the Prophet Muhammad for contemporary debates on masculinities, spirituality, and ethics. According to the Muslim tradition, the zenith of the Mi'raj, the journey, the Isra and the Mi'raj, the journey of heavenly ascension, the Prophet Muhammad entered a state of profound mystical intimacy. When offered the choice by God to abide in the state of bliss eternally or to return to the world, his single response was ummati, my community. The Prophet Muhammad's decision to return from a state of exquisite mystical union for the sake of humanity marks an ethical choice, one replete with the virtues of compassion, love, and generosity. From a Sufi perspective, one might describe it as the supreme act of beauty or the epitome of Jamal. Perhaps more than ever, ours is a time characterized by a dearth of ethical models personifying beauty, love, and expansive compassion. The current political landscape is a veritable showcase of toxic hegemonic masculinities running rogue on this planet, crisscrossing secular and religious spaces. A marked phenomenon of our time globally are the unapologetic forms of malevolent, arrogant, and rapacious male power. Increasingly, human vices manifested as sexism, racism, homophobia, ecocide, xenophobia, and at the moment, genocide, amongst other things, are brazenly paraded in the varying political theatres of the world. There is a rising tide of evidence unmasking prominent religious and political leaders as sexual predators. Indeed, the current state of the world aptly reflects what Umid Safi has described as a Jahili mode of consciousness, a state of being characterized not only by ignorance, representing an anxiety of the heart, but the extremity of the condition is succinctly captured by one of the linguistic associations of the term Jahili, with being like a rabid, mad dog. When observing the aggressive, indeed rabid, mad dog masculinities gaining traction in the world, one might diagnose it through a spiritual lens, that is, of the dominance of nafs al-ammara amongst human beings playing itself out on a collective scale. Indeed, the imperative for the collective refinement of character is not simply for personal well-being, but has extensive socio-political consequences and might be seen as the ethical critical challenge of our time. In seeking forms of human relationality that reflect more wholesome ways of being, Muslims possess a rich historical archive for alternative and varied models of masculinity. In this regard, scholars like Ozgan, Prado, and Amanullah de Sonde have each compellingly demonstrated the incredible proliferation of diverse and plural forms of masculinity in varying Muslim contexts. Masculinities as intrinsic or as an integral part of a specific social gender order are informed by a complexity of socio-political, economic, historic, and cultural factors, and are, I quote, sustained through a complex system of symbol, identities, and forces, unquote. Amanullah de Sonde has analyzed varying models of masculinity presented by the different prophetic figures, while Abdel Prado has illustrated to us the ways in which varied political imaginaries can birth radically different models of Muhammad and his masculinity. For Muslims, given the centrality of the Sunnah and the imperative of imitatio Muhammad, not only for men, but for all Muslims, there is an enduring existential and social power invested in representations of the Prophet Muhammad, who is presented in the Hadith tradition as being sent but to perfect beautiful character. Understandings of what precisely constitutes a Mohammedan model have varied implications on the ways in which religious ideals, and symbols around masculinity, femininity, human nature, gender, and authority emerge. For contemporary Muslims who seek to live in relationships to this model of virtue, a critical question relates to examining the different registers and notions of a Mohammedan model. A central issue relates to locating the historical Prophet Muhammad and his teachings within the particularities of his Arab context, and then making linkages and translations of this Mohammedan model into ways of being for contemporary Muslims. How does one relate to the 7th century Muhammad, who embodied a situated model of leadership and guidance, embedded and responsive to the specificities, the limitations, and the demands of his own socio-political context on the one hand, to, on the other hand, a transcendental notion of the Prophet Muhammad, one which the Quran describes as Rahmat al-Alameen, in that beautiful Quranic verse that said, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. That is the messenger who is sent but as a mercy to all of the worlds, not just to one world, but to all of the realms. The latter of this Quranic verse is an evocative and universal register of the Prophet Muhammad, who is seen by believers not only as a mercy in his time and place to his world, but to the world here and now, nourishing the numerous worlds, the inner world, the outer world, and the in-between levels of existence. At this level, Muslims throughout the ages and in the contemporary period continue to find an enduring relationship with the Mohammedan model. For contemporary Muslims, these choices are ultimately determined by what forms of discernment are invoked in distinguishing between the enduring moral, ethical, and spiritual teachings embodied by a prophet and the contextual realities reflected in the person of Muhammad ibn Abdullah of the 7th century. Indeed, every act of reading and representation of the life of the Prophet Muhammad is also simultaneously an act of interpretation, and prevailing images of the Prophet Muhammad say as much about their readers as they do about the Prophet. At another level, one might even say that there are as many Muhammads as there are Muslims, or as many readers of Muhammad. Each one draws on and remembers their prophet with the fullness of their own personalities, the state of their hearts, and the needs of their time. The recollections, invocations, and retrievals of the Prophet Muhammad invoke the whole range and spectrum of human inclinations, needs, and aspirations, ranging from the state of the most depraved ISIS soldier to the state of the most elevated of the awliya, or the saints, or the friends of Allah. In attempting to trace visions of Muhammad that respond to the deeper spiritual imperatives, I turn to particular Sufi understandings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. From the earliest time, Muslims have been inspired by the Quran and the Hadith in developing an understanding of the Prophet Muhammad as intimately interwoven with images of light. Beginning in the 9th century, Sahal al-Tustari's early Quranic commentary on the light verse, Surah An-Nur, depicts the Prophet as that primordial first light emerging from the one that bows down in adoration. This approach is developed into a sophisticated cosmology in the works of Ibn Arabi, for whom the light of Muhammad, or the Nur al-Muhammadi, is a central animating principle of all existence. Drawing on a number of hadith traditions, including where the Prophet Muhammad stated, "I was a prophet even while Adam was between clay and water." Ibn Arabi elaborates the concept of the Muhammadan reality, or the Haqiqa al-Muhammadiyya. That is, the ontological dimension of the prophetic light through which all creation comes into being. this Mohammedan seed of light is contained in each human being and in every prophet, culminating then in the final embodied historical prophet of Islam. Ibn Arabi links this creative impetus of the Nur al-Muhammadi to the rank of what he calls the originary divine breath of the merciful, the Nafas al-Rahman, the breath of the divine that imbues all creation with existence through the inbreathing of spirit. Central to this range of cosmological associations of the Prophet Muhammad, with the divine creative breath of the merciful God, are three constituents: the notion of light, of spirit, and of mercy, all central to understanding this religious anthropology, or this understanding of human nature. All human beings are imbued with the Mohammedan light, which is their deepest ontological reality, that guiding inner light that is fundamental to becoming a complete, realized human being, that is integral to when human beings can manifest Insan Kamil. And the complete human being, Insan Kamil, is one who integrates and embodies the perfect balance of the divine qualities, or the perfect calibration of those qualities. That is, the divine names of majesty and those of beauty, a balance embodied by the historical Muhammad and all prophets, as well as all realized human beings. So to reiterate, in this Sufi imaginary, the Nur al-Muhammadi is not simply found in the Prophet Muhammad of the 7th century, but it is the light of Muhammad that lives within each human life. Shaykh Jamal Nur Sargat, the contemporary Rifa'i teacher, tells us that while the Mohammedan light and character is inherent to every human being in every pore, she tells us in the manifestation of this character, in some, the manifestation of this character is illuminated, in some it is half illuminated, and in some it is dark, unquote. In relation to my reflections today, a central existential, spiritual, and political imperative is to unpack and to imagine ways that ideas of Mohammedan light might imbue contemporary Muslim models of humanity. Keeping in mind that the historical Muhammad embodied light in the ways that were luminous for the particular forms and configurations of darkness that characterize his time, a central challenge for contemporary Muslims is to discern and embody the forms of Mohammedan light needed in our times. An important question in this regard is, what are the Mohammedan models of virtue and beauty that will illuminate and dispel contemporary forms of darkness, which appear to be in no small part the consequence of catastrophic types of masculinity? More broadly, the greater universal contemporary moral and ethical challenge is, how do we create and live more benevolent forms of relationality that will nourish all humanity and the planet at large? And so to this end, I believe that Ibn Arabi's approach is deeply instructive. His idea of the archetypal human being, al-insan al-kamil, is a spiritually refined ethical self who harmonizes the full range of divine qualities, integrating Jamali attributes of beauty with those of majesty, the Jalali ones, in the appropriate balance. While Ibn Arabi states, and I quote, "In reality, there is nothing in existence but the divine names." That is, the divine attributes encompassing the full range of majesty and beauty constitute the ontological ground of being for humanity. He informs us that the tipping point in this process of refinement, which requires a person to recognize the specific limits and the proportions of the different divine attributes. So in this regard, Ibn Arabi counsels a fundamental priority of the qualities of love, compassion, sincerity, receptivity, and surrender, all derived from the divine names of beauty, the Asma al-Jamali. These, he informs us, are the starting and ending points of all spiritual work. As a person actively embodies Jamali attributes, they develop an inner ripeness for receiving the powerful and somewhat volatile Jalali names of majesty. What I call the epistemological privilege that Ibn Arabi accords to the Jamali attributes for human beings echoes, in fact, the ontological priority of divine Jamal, reflected in the Quranic view that God's mercy embraces everything, and the Hadith Qudsi, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "My mercy precedes my wrath," or "My mercy overcomes my wrath." So the overriding compassion of the divine undergirds and impels the Quranic understanding of Muhammad as that creation sent to humanity to serve as nothing other than a mercy to all the worlds. Thus, for humanity, the proper balance of divine attributes in the prophetic mold, as within the divine mold, is the abiding emphasis on Jamali attributes, or the qualities of beauty and mercy. Now, this is not simply a disregard for Allah's Jalal. No, in fact, the Jalal is deeply important. However, the seeker attempts to dissolve the unrefined Jalali instincts of one's nafs al-ammara in the ocean of God's Jamali attributes for the purposes of purification and refinement. In fact, Ibn Arabi cautions the seeker against claiming the more dangerous and potentially overwhelming Jalali attributes, since an imbalance of these exposes one, in fact, to precarity and spiritual jeopardy. In Sufi psychology, unrefined Jalali qualities are easily manipulated by the nafs al-ammara, or the lower self, or the commanding self, whose blindness to the true nature of reality causes one to be falsely acquisitive, arrogant, dominating, and constantly inhabiting exploitative forms of power. This is, in fact, a deep spiritual deficiency and is captured in the Quranic narrative of Iblis, or Satan, who epitomizes these kinds of Jalal in his refusal to obey God's command to prostrate before Adam. Satan's arrogant belief in his own superiority veiled and distorted his perceptions, ultimately resulting in his expulsion from the realm of divine intimacy. So too with human beings. The prompting of the lower self causes human beings to unjustly assert the divine attributes of power, thereby diminishing their own spiritual station and progress. Now, applying this lens to an analysis of toxic masculinities and the destructive shadows that they're unleashing wildly in the contemporary world, one might diagnose these as the symptoms of misaligned, crude, and unrefined Jalali or majestic attributes, qualities that are working currently at the behest of the lowest impulses of the self, and hence unpurified by the divine Jamal. We seem, at this moment, more critically than ever, in dire need of the individual and collective cultivation of Jamali attributes to enable the manifestation of a different form of politics undergirded by forms of nourishing relationality. More especially, Ibn Arabi suggests that when human beings embody Jamali qualities, they become instantiations of divine mercy, as in the following excerpt based on the hadith, one of the Hadith al-Qudsi. And I would like to read this Hadith Qudsi. Allah descends to stand in our place, so that when one of his servants is hungry, Allah says to the others, "I was hungry and you didn't feed me." And when one is thirsty, God says to his servants, I was dying of thirst and you didn't give me water. And when another of his servants was sick, God says, I was sick and you didn't attend to me. And when those servants ask him about all of this, God says to them, as for the one who was sick, if you had tended to him, you would have found me with him. And when someone was starving, if you had fed him, you would have found him with me. And so for the one who was thirsty, if you had given him water, you would have found me there. This is in Hadith al-Qudsi. So Ibn Arabi comments that this is one of the fruits of love when God comes down to us, indicating God's presence amongst the least, those occupying marginal and liminal social spaces. Here, divine love and mercy are such that God partakes in the conditions of deepest human need. As such, the seeker is compelled to respond compassionately to the needs of those weakened through illness, hunger, and thirst. And such a response to other human beings is in fact, and in effect, a response to God's presence. Here, it is imperative to understand illness, hunger, and thirst at all of its registers, the physical forms experienced, but also the social experiences of illness, hunger, and thirst born from injustice, dehumanization, and marginality, experiences socially and politically that we are confronted with daily, particularly in the situation of Gaza and other parts of the world. Within these realities, acting with compassion thus is not merely an extension to another human being, but an active connection to the divine beloved. Viewed from such a perspective, the benefactor is not simply the benevolent person who attends with merciful compassion to a poor, needy other. In fact, the needs of a poor, hungry, ill person provides a fertile opportunity for a fellow human being to encounter God. Moreover, such a person is not merely an intermediary, but in and through that person's predicament or that political predicament, God, as the embodiment of love, is fully present. Through his take on the spiritual dynamics of such a relationship, Ibn Arabi destabilizes the normative power relationship between giver and recipient. Both parties in this relationship give and receive divine mercy. The humanity and the divinity of each are tied to the other, and all is a product of divine love. In such a framework, mercy, rahmah, is an integral manifestation of divine love and the Nur al-Muhammadi. Spiritual development constantly demands an ethics of care that is socially engaged. This is a vision of spirituality that impels compassionate and just modes of human relationality. Such a method not only provides a general critique of abusive social hierarchies and discriminatory masculinist ideologies, but also rejects political structures that prize aggression and other unrefined Jamali qualities, which continue to bring war, destruction, genocide, suffering, and death. Over and above providing a critique of these hostile social norms, Ibn Arabi's framework directs one to the alternatives, in which the qualities of mercy, compassion, care, justice, generosity, patience, forbearance, and forgiveness are prioritized among human beings. Translating these virtues and qualities to illuminate and respond to the challenges of our time is the imperative of a Mohammedan model of light, a model of humanity, and a model of masculinity. So I would like to conclude this paper with an evocative story of the Prophet Muhammad. And I have deliberately presented a story reflecting on the quality of the Prophet's relationships and leadership in the more intimate, smaller spaces, rather than those about stark political issues and context, because I think this story, this rather sweet story, has in fact very large implications. In a hadith reported by Abu Huraira, found in the Book of Fasting in Sahih Muslim, this is how the story goes. A man came before the Prophet and said, "I am ruined, O Messenger of God." "And what is it that has ruined you?" asked the Prophet. And the man replied, "I had sex with my wife during the fast of Ramadan." The Prophet said, "Are you able to free a slave?" "No," said the man. "Well, how about feeding 60 poor people?" Again, the man said, "No, I cannot do that." So the Prophet sent someone who returned with a basket full of dates and said to the man, "Take these and give them to charity." The man asked, "To poorer people than myself?" And continued, "There is no household between the two lava plains of Medina more in need of it than us." The Prophet laughed until you could see his molar teeth and said, "Go and feed your family with it." In this human encounter, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is indeed the uswatun hasana, the beautiful example, the exemplary example. One who, even in holding someone accountable to a ritual obligation, is more invested in care and the well-being of that human being and of the broader community. The narrative presents, I think, an integrated ethics that weaves together the realms of ibadah or worship and that of socioeconomic relations or mu'amalat as integrally connected. That a ritual transgression is through prophetic wisdom best compensated for through acts of generosity to those on the margins of the community, through acts that positively impact one's fellow human beings. Freeing slaves, feeding the poor are ways to redress one's lapse or transgression of the boundaries of a ritual obligation. And equally important in the story is that the Prophet lovingly holds the human being who anxiously confesses to him in a relationship defined by generosity, largesse, and enormous kindness. Here is a model of overflowing compassion, love, and even wonderful humor. When Muslims seek inspiration and discernment, they have the stories of the historical Muhammad that can echo and amplify Nur al-Muhammadi, ever present in their own beings. Discerning a luminous Muhammad masculinity for our times, reading for and apprehending a responsive model of the Uswatun Hasana is paradoxically always also determined by how much of the Nur al-Muhammadi is active, alive, and illuminated in the state of the reader, the seeker, or the community. I thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I don't know what words I can use to describe how beautiful it is. You had a lovely combination of mind and heart at the same time, both being important and beautifully balanced and real and practical. And you brought it to the, very practical response to the struggles of our time and real down to earth. Thank you so much for that. Professor, that was fantastic. Thank you. So now what I would like to do is invite everyone who would like to have questions or make any comments to please put your hand up using the electronic hands up, and we'll go around and in a who comes first gets the first question. So please go ahead. And if you don't know where to find the raise your hand, you can just raise your hand. And if you're on a video and I can see you, or if you want to use the chat, you're welcome to do that as well. We can read what you write in the chat.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Sir, it was such a pleasure to listen. I just wanted to thank her and just was curious about why don't we find Sufi thinkers or scholars of Sufism much engaging with these social implications of this radical vision of oneness. For example, this social justice, for example, we hardly find Sufis critiquing interest-based economies, for example, and other key structures where key exploitative.
I'm sorry, I have a difficulty hearing. I don't know if it's just me. There is an aeroplane flying over, but if you can maybe just speak a little bit louder.
Okay, I am audible. Am I audible to you?
A little bit better.
Okay, I just wanted to ask, first I want to thank you for your wonderful talk. We have been much waiting for it. I was wondering why Sufi thinkers in general and Sufi modern scholars of Sufism have not been much engaging with the problems of social justice. For example, we hardly find them engaging with the problems of interest-based economies and other key exploitative structures, socio-economic both. So, do we find any reference in Ibn Arabi on these economic issues, or do we find modern scholars of Ibn Arabi engaging ever with this, trying to really actualize God's these attributes of mercy and all these how Jamali attributes which we call, which cannot be in a way actualized in a world which is dominated by, exploitative this economic structures. So do we find any concerted effort to revive, for example, the infaq or zakat system in Sufi writers? Or do you find Ibn Arabi in detail engaging with these things or not?
Sorry, I don't know if others are struggling to hear, but so I'm going to respond to the extent that I could understand the question. I'm so sorry, Ma'ruf. Perhaps I should get earphones because I couldn't hear very well your question, but I did get parts of it. So
do you like me to have a go at giving you, can you hear me better than you can hear Dr. Maruf?
Yes, I can hear you quite clearly, Frank. So I don't know.
Dr. Maruf speaks from his mobile phone, and we often find hearing him is a bit more difficult than hearing the rest of the people. I think Dr. Maruf was wanting to know, why is it not so that the current Sufi practitioners and sheikhs and so on are not involved in today's problems of economic and so on, social problems in the world? Why are they not involved with this? This is basically a summary of what I think he's saying.
So I think that, there have been historically and, in the current period, a variety of ways in which, in my understanding, Sufis have engaged the social orders, whatever those might be, whether we're talking about socio-political issues, economic issues, etc. And there's been a range of ways in which, there's been a range of approaches. So historically, there have been the spectrum of kind of what we would call apolitical or quietist Sufis. And I think this is probably the case for people that have been on the spiritual path in a variety of traditions. You've had people that have thought of spiritual life as being the domain of the personal and the cultivation of the self in not necessarily the most socially engaged ways. It's seen, as more ascetic. This has been one end of the spectrum, all the way into, highly socially engaged. We know historically that there have been Sufi tariqas that have been part of anti-colonial moves in the Caucasus, in North Africa. We've had, some extraordinary Sufi sheikhs that have been at the forefront and warriors against colonialism, warriors against all kinds of socioeconomic injustice. So I think, and in between, human beings have kind of navigated that space in a variety of ways. And I think the impetus to disengage the social and the political, in my view, is from spiritual life, reflects perhaps a lack of integrity about thinking through the nature of the spiritual. What is the world but the workshop of the soul? How, in fact, are we intended to engage the world as people that are on a path? Or for Sufis, everything, in my view, is, and not just in my view, in the Quranic view, ayat. The social horizons provide the ayat, or the signs of the time. And the human being is intended to engage with and bring into fruition the virtues and the ethics within not only the personal realm, but the way in which the personal realm develops is in relationship to the social and the socio-political. And so I think that I think that there are various Sufi orders that do different things. And sometimes people do the social or engage the social in smaller ways, and sometimes they do so in larger ways. And I think that for all human beings, not just for Sufis, the contemporary landscape demands us to think about the integrity between the spiritual and the social, between virtue, between the cultivation of self-refinement and what public virtue looks like. Because ultimately, sometimes I've been both in terms of looking at the South African context, living in my own local context, and sometimes being very, very frustrated with the polity and the ruling party and the political world. And that's just not in South Africa. I think if we look globally, we have such a arena of right-wing political leaders. We have an arena of current unfolding of genocide, where people are just involving themselves in the most bizarre self-deception, for the most, in a tragic way, in a really tragic way. And this incapacity to see the link between the spiritual life and the social and political life is resulting in the kinds of deeply destructive social structures we currently have. And so I sometimes think that what we're seeing is a collective nafs al-ammara on the social landscape manifest out loud. And, it's fine for us to say, oh my word, that's just the political leaders. But actually, if we take one step back, this is our world. We each are contributing to it somehow. And we each need to contribute to its transformation. And we can do that for those that take the spiritual life seriously, as thinking about the integrity between what it is that we want to cultivate on the inner and what it is that we contribute and cultivate in terms of the outer. And, I'm very fond of the saying that, Cornel West has recently invoked it, but I do think that it comes from the Reverend Martin Luther King. And this idea of justice is the face of love in the public sphere. That love might be something that we cultivate internally in our beings. For the divine, love is something that we show in intimate spaces with our loved ones and our loved community. But justice is what love looks like in the public space. And justice is also what love looks like in the domestic space. And in fact, in all social spaces. And so the integrity between the cultivation of love for God and love for humankind is why I think justice is so important. And so, yeah, that's a very long-winded response to a short question. So let me stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Saddiya. That was fantastic. Somebody said, I'm sorry, I'm not here to answer questions on your behalf, but being the host, I think I'll make a statement if it came to my mind. Somebody said that to have a green forest, you have to have green trees. So each one of us is involved in doing our bit to make sure that the whole thing includes what we all want it to include. Thank you for that.
Beautiful image. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you. Nur Alam, you can go ahead if you like, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Saddiya. Such a beautiful presentation. And it's really appealing and very resourceful and detailed. So it gives us a lot of learning for us. And of course, as you mentioned, our society is turning away. So we need to bring to the center stage all this knowledge, which has been with us with the human history. But of course, we are falling behind. And as a result, the more we discuss these aspects, of the perfect, beautiful character, the uswatun hasana, our prophet, and that is of course is an important area we needed to focus. So you mentioned about ontological dimension of prophetic light, and you also mentioned light of Muhammad in every human being, and so, and of course, Ibn Arabi's one of the doctrine is the Mohammedan reality, the Hakika Muhammadiyah. Um, and some people thinks, dispute about it, because they say there is no direct hadith about, though it says that prophet was a prophet before Adam when he was in mud and water, but still people think it is, we are extending prophetic Muhammad beyond, we are doing shirk or something like that. Some people think, especially traditional Muslim. So to that extent, the question is, Allah in Quran says, وَنَحْفَخْتُ فِيهِ رُوحَنَا, we have blown my spirit into Adam. So if that is the Prophet Muhammad, what's your understanding from that perspective?
Thank you, Noor. So I think that there's always going to be different registers of how human beings engage with, with a tafsir of the Quran or an understanding of the Hadith, and different levels of different states, different consciousness, different needs, will read into these Hadith traditions of I was in existence while Adam was still between clay and water. The ways in which human beings understand them will be varied. And so I think that, you're going to get people that say, well, actually, this is shirk. They've had that response to Ibn Arabi, right? There's been that response to ideas of Wahdat al-Wujud, that is, collapsing the boundaries between God and human beings. That's that particular understandings of Nur al-Muhammadi as being this universal light. It's one way to understand it. It's one way that Ibn Arabi has offered for us to understand it. Now, people can have very different understandings of what that means. And I think those different understandings correspond to different needs. But I do think that he provides us with a very universal understanding of the Prophet Muhammad, and a very universal understanding of the light of God created in each human life. And so in that sense, it's actually quite different even. It's, some would say it's that new Platonic idea of this kind of emanation from the one, that first light that emerged. The name given to that was Nur al-Muhammadi. In my view, it's not necessarily as much of a reflection on the historical Prophet Muhammad. That's what I was trying to communicate, that it's not the historical Prophet Muhammad, because that indeed might be shirk, because that's a human being. And that human being, despite being Rahmatul Alameen, was a human being subject to the human conditions with limitations as well. With, when he got asked about where a certain plant should be, a certain date should be planted, he said here, and then that wasn't the right place. And people said, oh, well, you told us this. He says, well, I'm not a farmer. That's not my area of knowledge, right? So in that regard, he's very human. We have this beautiful story in the Quran where the blind man comes to him and he turns in a very human way. He's trying to convince these kind of arrogant Quraysh leaders of the importance of what he was teaching. And so he was busy in this kind of conversation. And this blind man comes to him with a question, and he frowns at the man, right? And so there's an entire Quranic reprimand, a divine reprimand from God to this historical, situated, located, very human Muhammad who can understandably be irate when he's in the middle of trying to convince these powerful people, because the implications for his community would be great in that context, right? If he managed to convince the powerful leaders. So you understand that response. It's a very understandable human response to say, hang on, like I'm just busy trying to do something here. But there was a reprimand, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to the Prophet, you know, you're trying to convince these hard-hearted people. Here's a man with a receptive heart needing you. And in that moment is a teaching moment for us. It's not just that I mean, there's a huge amount of teaching. I've actually written a little piece on this, the story, which I really love. But there's a moment for us as human beings to see that the Quran is saying to us that this Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam is a human being, subject to the limitations and the problems of being human. And that's absolutely fine. In fact, I think one of the reasons that I personally love the Prophet so much is that I see all of the human dimensions to him, and then can relate to him more, because the limitations of the human condition are something that, irrespective of his prophecy, he shares with us. And so we have, for me, that's a deeper, it's a deeper connection with this human being in a moment of time. So that is a human being like the rest of us at some level. At another level, very, much more sublime than the rest of us, but at some level, subject to the constraints and the limitations of human personality. The Nur al-Muhammadi, on the other hand, is that light of Muhammad. And that light of Muhammad is the light within each human heart. And in fact, I mean, there's this beautiful, in my book on Ibn Arabi, I also kind of outline this idea of the cyclical view that Ibn Arabi has of this light that emerges from the Nur al-Muhammadi. It's called this Nur al-Muhammadi. It is what it is that kind of is the very, the substrate or the very source of all creation. It is through which, that Adam gets that light of the Ruh, that Nafas al-Rahman is connected to this Nur al-Muhammadi. It travels through all of the prophets. All of the prophets had this Nur al-Muhammadi, and it's manifest in all prophets and comes into realization in the final Prophet Muhammad. So, I mean, perhaps we call it the Nur al-Muhammadi because we have this love for Muhammad, but perhaps it's just Nur, right? It's just that illumination that goes through each prophet, and we can connect in the Muslim tradition to it as Nur al-Muhammadi, because we can both have that universal register of a light that can be very abstract if you're just thinking of it outside of this loving, sweet connection to a human being of Muhammad that we have in our hearts. And so for me, it's those registers, that Nur al-Muhammadi is this register of the light that we can both see the universal dimension of the Prophet Muhammad, and the particular historical register, but also that we can recognize the human registers in ourselves and the divine registers in ourselves, that we can recognize that this Nur comes from the one, is the same Nur that has traveled through every prophet, through every teaching, through every revelation, through the various wisdom traditions, through the various wisdom teachers, and rests in each human heart and is as accessible to each of us, contingent on our state, contingent on what we make available of ourselves. But that full form of Nur is and has been available in the same way it's been available to the Prophet Muhammad, to every other prophet, to every other wise teacher, to every other purified teacher, and to every single human life upon this planet. Now, the fact that the evidence that we have of so much darkness in the planet is not a reflection of a lack of the Muhammadan light. It's a reflection of choices that veil this heart in darkness, that put veils upon veils upon veils of darkness upon that which is intrinsically the human condition. And we all have veils of darkness that we put on our hearts. None of us is in this, or at least I certainly, and I'm sure many of us are struggling with different ways in which we remove those veils of smallness, of meanness, of lack of generosity, of, what it is that we struggle in our daily lives, whatever that is. And each of us have different natures and different things that we attempt to refine, to cultivate, to develop. So that reflection on the Nur al-Muhammadi in each life, in my view, is the way in which you connect the universal to the particular, the kind of the transcendental to something that is relatable and an object of love.
Thank you, Professor Saddiya. So a couple of chats there, which I'll read in a moment, but I just wanted to ask a question which sort of relates to both of these in many ways. You mentioned al-insan al-kamil on one hand, and you mentioned nafs al-ammara on the other hand. So, and I think you implied that the insan, Nur al-Muhammadi is basically an expression of the insan al-kamil, which potentially we all have, all human beings as well. It's not just Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we have this two sides: the supreme love and generosity and living the insan al-kamil on one hand, and the terribly arrogant ego, personal self on the other hand. But to be honest, I think none of us is at either of these ends. We are all somewhere in the middle, 3/4 of the way, 1/4 of the way. We're somewhere in between. So potentially we are doing the right things to some degree, and we are doing the wrong things to some degree, depending on the degree that we're doing it. So I think, I mean, the question is, how to ask this question? Because we are both capable of doing both, which really means we are actually doing both. So that's the reason why the expression that's coming out in the collective of the world it's got quite a lot of negativity. It's reflecting the negativity that we have within ourselves. So how can the one individual, if we faced with doing activism and jumping up and down and giving more money than we can afford, or should we let go and let thy will be done and sit back, and this is not really in our hands, and allow the divine to take over? So there's this in between. So which one of these shall we do? Which also both of these are within us. We can allow the divine within us to and if that is the case, is that an activist position, or is that the opposite? Because the arrogant can be very activist.
Thank you, Frank, for that excellent question. And it's a question that I have had grappled with. Some of my own spiritual teachers have, kind of had. It's a question that I think continues to kind of occupy me quite a lot, especially in this time when there's a genocide that many of us are seeing unfolding on a daily basis. And just feel quite helpless. So it's also a question of like, how do you deal with this unfolding violence? So I'm going to render, I've been an activist for much of my life and continue to be so, and see it as integral to how I think about spirituality, and developing my own spiritual life. That having been said, having been an activist, I have seen some of the most phenomenal egos at play in the activist field. It's remarkable to me, and quite, if you can take one step back, it's amusing and horrifying simultaneously. People that are, great activists for anti-racism, or, in South Africa, I've encountered that, or, on a political course, amongst my own group of anti-apartheid activists, I've encountered some of the most sublime human beings, most selfless, generous, kind, merciful, selfless human beings, and then some of the most arrogant egos, where the cause of the public good is just another theater, and there's no integration of that into their own kind of personal interpersonal interaction. So the so-called public space. So we have that capacity for the ego to say, I'm a social activist, I'm going to stand up for the good, I am going to be transforming the world. And the social justice imperative, which is a deeply spiritual imperative, is open to the corruption of the nafs. I've seen this in
Yes.
numerous spaces, and actually it's quite a disturbing reality that many people that have been in activist spaces can recognize. They can recognize that the ego comes in and it does what it does, and it kind of transforms that space. So I'm not saying that this stuff, is, one has to, in every space, be deeply attentive to both the inner and the outer. I think that an imbalance of one side to the other results in an imbalance that can be quite destructive. So in order to have genuinely transformative social justice movements and activist movements, one, I think, in the long term, needs to be really thinking about how to be attentive to both the inner and the outer when one is working in the outer space. So that having been said, I think that's one thing that's really important to kind of say. There's also, of course, as you've noted, the kind of the tension. And I don't know that it's I think there's different ways to think about this. Some people might frame it as a tension between kind of a surrender to divine will and kind of activism. I mean, the reality is at a very basic theological level. You have been given, all human beings have been given this amana, this trust. They are Khalifatullah, they are meant to be in this world to be moral agents. Moral agency is about not simply something that you kind of exercise in a personal way. It's about an engagement. I mean, this early kinds of prophetic, the Prophet himself was both a person that spent time in the cave of Hira, in different kinds of retreats, in khalwas, and was a political leader and was a social justice activist, I would say. I think there's different ways to read that, but was clearly a social justice warrior. And so I think that model is the model that we need to be thinking about, and the balance between the inner and the outer. Now, that having been said, I have had wise people that I love and consider to be some of my most inspirational teachers. There's a lovely translator of Ba Muhyiddin, who I see as very much as my own spiritual father. And on many occasions over the last 30 years or close to 30 years, I have asked him about various things that I felt very passionately about at the political level. And he would always tell me the story about, and the same story, he would invoke the same story every time I came to him, all filled with anger and frustration at the nature of the world. And he would tell me the story about this person, in the midst of all this very intense situation with a gun pointed to the head. And then there would be this voice that says, "Wake up." And he would say to me, "This is the nature of the world, Saddiya. You are being very moved by all of the craziness that's going on in the world, but this is not real." Now, Allahu Alam, but my understanding, I have great difficulty with that understanding. I'm sure there's a level of truth to it. I'm very sure that there's a level of truth to it. But at my level and at my understanding, whether it's real or unreal, this is the dunya that I've been placed in. And in my understanding, we have to do and pitch up and respond. And perhaps not with the anger that I often do, perhaps with the calibration. I think anger is very important. I think anger impels you to justice. But if you stay with the anger, it can be quite a corrupting influence. So the question is, how do you transform that space and say, yes, this might be only a dream. I might only wake up. That hadith is true. At the time when we die, that, you wake up, and that's the real world. And yes, that's the ultimate reality. But this too is a reality that we are here to do and to transform and to act within. And so while I leave that station of recognizing just the illusionary nature of this world to those that are at a higher level, for myself, I think I don't think one can escape the political reality of engaging the world. Perhaps the question of waking up is to kind of engage it with an understanding that, كل من عليها فان, all of this will perish. And the face of your Lord, the possessor of majesty and beauty, is all abiding. And this is something that I am taking a lot of refuge in this time, which has been very hard for many of us globally. So, كل من عليها فان, may all of the ugliness and the inhumanity and the brutality, may this too pass, and may it pass quickly before more children are decimated.
Very true. I mean, so we have a couple more questions. Patricia, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, I often ask myself what the Prophet Muhammad would do now in this situation. And you talk about toxic masculinity, and I think I would like to say a lack of masculinity at the moment, because when you watch actually the genocide and everything that's going on, I ask myself, where are the men and where is the masculine response to all of this? It seems that from my limited perspective, I can't imagine Prophet Muhammad sitting there and doing nothing in such a situation where children, women need to be protected, and yet nations all across the world are basically doing absolutely nothing. Now, I heard your speech more as a preference for the more Jamali, the more feminine qualities, but I think personally what is lacking at the moment is the avenger, the more masculine qualities of Allah that I don't see manifested right now in our world. So I think there's an imbalance and we need more masculinity, true masculinity, rather than more passive sitting on our hands and watching the most atrocious things going on. I don't know how you respond to that, but my question always is, what would Prophet Muhammad do in this situation? And he wouldn't just sit there and do nothing. That's how I feel.
Thank you, Patricia. I think you're right on the head. I think maybe we need to define our terms, right? And maybe that's helpful. I think I 100% agree with you. I think that this is a time for great Jalali attributes, for a time of Jalal. The argument that I was making in paper, though, is that, in fact, I mean, if we take one step back, all of everything, all of reality, all of action, all of human beings are manifestation of divine attributes, right? It's the lack of calibration, the lack of balancing, the lack of refinement between these different attributes that creates toxicity, or that creates injustice, that creates a lack of harmony. And so my argument is that what we are seeing is a form of masculinity. It's a very toxic form of masculinity in the Israeli military, for example, in the ways in which America enables the support of what is going on, in the way Europe, and in the way that all of these people are watching these, the decimation of a community and are supporting it by sending arms to Israel. So, they are part of this very, very unrefined Jalali attributes of power. And what we're seeing is an unleashing of this unrefined Jalal. What we need is a refined Jalal. And a refined Jalal means an integration with the Jamal, is the argument that I'm making. So you cannot have, so for me, Jamal is not about a sweet kind, like a chilling, passive kind of existence in the world. The argument that I make in this work and in my book as well is that it is when we completely immerse ourselves in divine love, compassion, mercy, that the right calibration of Jalal can be reflected, developed, refined. We cannot make that claim because our nafs will go boom smack. That's what Iblis did. That's what we're seeing here. It's a Jalal that says me, myself, I. It is power, and it's a power that's completely lacking in any kind of spiritual alignment. So indeed, we need a true masculinity. And that true masculinity that we're calling for is, in fact, not just a masculinity. It's a true humanity. It's what does it mean to kind of bring, I actually prefer to play with these terms of masculinity and femininity. I'm using them because what I think needs to be identified is a certain kind of historical ways in which male power has worked. And so it's important for us to recognize that as a particular kind of problem in our time, right? And so I use that as a way of critique. But I think if we looking, so that's at the level of what the problem is. If I'm imagining, and if I'm looking, and if I'm talking to in reflection and in conversation with people like Ibn Arabi and some of the great spiritual masters and leaders and guides of our time, then we're not just speaking about masculinity. We're speaking about a humanity that calibrates Jalal and Jamal. And I don't think of Jalal. Actually, I would prefer not to use masculine and feminine, because wrongly, in my view, and this has been some of the people within the best scholarship of Ibn Arabi that have said, well, actually the Jalal has attributed to a kind of masculine dimension and the Jamal to a feminine dimension. And I think that's fine, but that's our mapping of how we think of masculinity and femininity. We are projecting our social norms of what constitutes masculinity and femininity onto the divine Jamal and Jalal, which does not designate itself as masculine or feminine. Jalal and Jamal is the majesty and the beauty inherent in the divine, It is the majesty and beauty through which the attributes have manifested in us and in all creation. And we are meant to balance the Jalal and the Jamal. So I would say, I prefer not to say that Jamali is feminine and Jalali is masculine. I would like to say all of that is insani, and to be able to become kamil, to become complete, to calibrate, to get that perfect balance of awwal wal akhir wal zahir wal batin, the first, the last, the manifest and the hidden. That state of kamil, of that balance of those attributes, is possible through a calibration where you immerse all of the attributes in the divine Jamal, and then you let the divine Jalal come and manifest its power through that immersion in beauty, in love, in compassion. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, call me by Allah or call me by Rahman. That is the name that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prioritized, Ar-Rahman. Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim are the two attributes that the Quran uses most regularly. It's the attributes in the Islamic tradition. And if you want to look at it, the root of it is Raham. Raham has the same root as womb, the idea of the womb of compassion and mercy, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ontologically says that my mercy precedes my wrath or overcomes my wrath. So this idea of the divine, what we would call the divine feminine in some quarters, Rahman and Rahim, but what I would say as the Jamali essence of God, that God asserts God's self. Allah says about God's self that this is ontologically prior. This is what all emerges from. We are the manifestation of Nafas Rahman, the breath of the merciful, right? So this ontological priority of the Jamal is given in God's self. The Prophet is described explicitly as Rahmatul Alameen. That same rahmah, that same compassion is the essence of the Prophet. So the Jamal is prioritized. Across the board, the Jamal is prioritized. I'm also saying we need to recognize that it's this kind of soaking, immersive experience in the Rahman that will allow a kind of masculinity, a kind of humanity, a kind of way to emerge where justice and this assertion, this clear and strong assertion that is and it is that jihad that we need to embrace. It's that jihad. It's that kind of struggle, that struggle to speak strongly, to be assertive, to stand up, to take action, is part of the imperative of what real masculinity, real humanity must look like in this time where we are just seeing, this kind of horror unfolding. And of course, human beings have had this kind of horror unfolding in various different spaces and times. I don't think that we, though, have been able to experience it so firsthand. If you have an Instagram page of Al Jazeera, where you're just literally seeing this unfold on a daily basis, every day, it's a kind of witness that I've never borne to before. And so I think that there's a way in which it impacts and calls upon us in very different ways. And sometimes in ways that are deeply distressing because, as individuals, and yes, and I think, and I have to say that, subhanAllah, it's, I'm of the school and, that prayer is of extraordinary importance, prayer is of extraordinary and action is of extraordinary importance. And both of those things are simultaneously of extraordinary importance in this time. And so whatever actions are possible, and sometimes the actions might only be prayer, but at other times there are other kinds of actions available to us, and we need to partake of that. And sometimes I think, I'm on all kinds of BDS imperatives and working hard with a group of scholars at my own institution to ask for a boycott of Israeli institutions, which has been received with great deal of opposition from certain quarters. And sometimes I feel, we spend all this time trying to, mobilize for these very things that is making no difference to the life of the Palestinians right now. What is my proposal on BDS? What is that doing for lives at the moment? But it's what I can do in this space. I can attend protests. I can do what I need to do. I can work on this. It's what's the small bit that's available to me right now. I can agitate my government. And, alhamdulillah, we also in South Africa, we have a particularly strong pro-Palestinian, very clear position, which makes it easier to negotiate these spaces in South Africa if you're standing up in opposition. I know friends in the UK and the US, I don't know what Australia is like, but it's ridiculous because there's such a conflation between anti-Semitism and just sheer, there's a conflation and a very deliberate political manipulation of what was historically a very legitimate thing around anti-Semitism with a kind of a pro-Zionist position, which is deeply problematic. Anyway, I don't really want to expand too much into that, but I hope that answers at least some of your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Saddiya. We're getting very close to the end of the time, so I would like to ask Akib to just ask the last question, and maybe if we have time, I can read all the chats in one go, and maybe you can have a go at giving one response to all of them. They are fairly related. Please go ahead, Akib.
Thank you so much, Frank. Thank you so much, Professor. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. And we are very thankful to you that you accepted our invitation. I know we are running out of time, but I just want to ask a very quick question. Professor, in this discourse of the atemporal Mohammedan light and the critique of toxic masculinities, which is reflected in your work and talk also, how do you see the role of the Maryam, historical character Maryam, or I must say, or the light of the Maryam, because we have historical evidence that Maryam in her own times not only challenges the normative orders, which were driven by maybe male symbolic orders, because she was challenging, critiquing the orders of the temple, which were somehow male dominated, or and at the same time she was socially engaged and transforming herself and transforming the community also. So for some of the historians, she emerges as the archetypal kind of woman who challenges at that time some of the most toxic sort of normative orders of the temple. So how does her unique position contributes to this nuanced critique of the masculinity within this broader framework of ethical enlightenment, or you, as you rightly point out, the Mohammedan light and the ethical enlightenment associated with it?
Thank you, Akib. I mean, of course, the character of Sayyidina Maryam is so powerful and beautiful, and actually open to so much, so many layers, I think, that have been, some of that have been historically unpacked, and others that I think are still open for us to be rethinking. And I think, the archetype of all of the, some of the archetypes in the Quran, some of the archetypes, I mean, of course, as many Islamic feminists have pointed out, that the Quran is one of the very few sacred texts that actually outlines the pangs of the birth condition. When Maryam alayhi salatu salam, I'm just going off at a little tangent, but I always find this very beautiful, that the Quran has this this depiction of Maryam in her birth pangs saying, "I wish I didn't exist," which many women can relate to if you've had a child, and this idea that God's grace descends in this moment. And this is depicted in the Quran. And I'm saying this because what it does is that it renders, a woman's experience on the everyday in the center of sacred text in a way that becomes a model for how to be thinking around surrender and the struggles with surrender. So that is just, Akib, sorry, I love that story of Maryam. And so I'm reflecting on that in that way. But I think Maryam alayhi salatu salam is an incredibly powerful character precisely for the ways that you've outlined. I think the idea of a woman who is unwed, I don't think we stay enough with that story. I know there's been a critique from a number of feminist quarters, but I think there's something still very beautiful in the archetypal story of an unwed mother, of a prophet who is isolated, who actually, and I think the point that you're making up front is absolutely profound. There's this idea of a woman in the innermost niche of the temple, which was preserved at that time amongst the Jewish elite for only men. And she's there, and she's discovered with fruits, summer fruits in the winter and winter fruits in the summer, this miraculous thing. And this, what is the symbolism of this miraculous thing? It's a subversion of the dominant social order, in my view. It's the way in which we think about what can come from the divine is not of the kind of categories that we ourselves are used to. It subverts both the gender order, it subverts how we think about religious authority, it subverts how we think about the ways in which we assume that the normative gender orders is in this particular, in my own reading, the normative gender orders are to be accepted. It's about what true spiritual presence with the divine that Maryam alayhi salatu wasalam had allowed for this kind of grace that descended from on high. And so Maryam then becomes this archetypal figure. But Arabi has also these beautiful ways in which he speaks about the creation models, right? So he speaks about the creation models of Adam and Hawa, and then of Maryam and Isa. He actually balances them. I don't know if you've encountered this, but it's so beautiful because, you know, he speaks about how, you know, while in the Quran there's no idea of you know, Eve coming from Adam or Hawa coming from Adam, that there is that part in the Hadith tradition that comes along, and there's those kind of texts and stories that come from the Israeliyat into Muslim tafsir, etc., into the exegesis of Adam and Hawa. And so he says in the same way, so he's speaking to these stories and these imaginaries and these archetypes of, you know, if you think of this woman, Eve, coming from Adam, if we buy that story, then we think, so a woman coming from a man, or in terms of the origin of creation, then you have a man coming from a woman without an intermediary. And that man is Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, Jesus coming from Mary. And so he speaks, what I love about what Ibn Arabi does with these two stories, he says you get Eve from a man, sourced from a man, you have Isa sourced from a woman. And then he says, yeah, that's fine. But for the rest of us, we come from men and women alike. And so he debunks this kind of gender norm in this really interesting way by saying you have this parallel. And he speaks about Maryam alayhi salatu wasalam as this figure that's so powerful in thinking through this archetype of human beings. And so I think Maryam alayhi salatu wasalam is really, I think there's still a lot of work to be done. But I think that the light that she embodies, both in terms of being the conduit, being this, you know, she's prayed for, and then there's this astounded thing that, oh, well, it's just a woman, and that in that social context was, well, I wanted this, you know, the spiritually enlightened being done, it's just a woman, and indeed, just this woman was indeed spiritually enlightened and was the source that was only welcomed into the niche of the temple, and that got all of these graces from the divine, and that was the conduit and the way in which Isa alayhi salatu wasalam enters the world. And so it helps us to reconfigure the light of Maryam. But Akib, I would also love to hear your reflections further on this. I think we might be over time, but we have a minute. Frank, let me leave this to your chairpersonship.
I'm very happy for you to take ownership of the time. Yeah, it's up to you, Dr. Saddiya. Please go ahead and decide.
Sorry, can I just have a quick look at where my sister is? I'm supposed to meet her. All right, I have 2 or 3 minutes more.
Thank you, Professor. It was precisely for this idea I was trying to bring in the story or the archetype of Maryam, because we mostly see when we try to discuss different historical figures, for example, Prophet Muhammad and his wives like Aisha and others. When we try to critique certain of the masculine narratives, but we hardly see the figure of Maryam bringing into this debate of critiquing the masculinity. When from the other side, we have strong historical evidence that how she challenged at that time, the Jewish law, the Jewish normative laws, and the laws of the temple, and her journey, some of the historical evidence, a journey from her place to the Egypt, and then she comes back. And she was also, how she was socially engaged, as you rightly point out. She was living in the corner of the temple, which was a powerful testament from Maryam to the authority at that time. And her archetype, as an archetypal woman, embodying the light, the nur, the light of critiquing the male-dominated norms which were prescriptive for women, especially, and how she was chosen for that cause. As you rightly point out, her labor pain when she sort of wished, which is also mentioned in the Quran, that I wish I had not born in the first place. So I was trying to point out in light of your work throughout the years, that how do you see the role of such historical archetypal women, especially Maryam, as a pointer to the further scholarship while trying to critique the masculinity within the broader Islamic tradition. I believe that some of the mystic figures or Sufi, movements and groups, they bring in the light of Maryam, the story of Maryam, but somehow they restrict her narrative, her import to personalized idea of, attaining the divine spark of God, but not broadening the narrative, and positioning her narrative in the contemporary debate of critiquing the male sort of dominated laws, prescriptive laws for women, or different discourses. Not somehow I feel broadening her, narrative and struggle as a broader archive for critiquing such, I must say, artificial laws for women within the broader Islamic, I must say, heterodox Islamic tradition. That's I was trying to point out in the light of your work. Her import, her broader import, and lastly, when Muhammad was told through Surah Maryam, chapter Maryam, the story of Maryam in the context of 7th century Arabi and Mecca. I think right after the revelation of this story in the Mecca, there emerged some of the powerful women believers in Mecca who converted to Islam, and they found enlightenment within this narrative when Muhammad was preaching this narrative in the 7th century Makkah. And then there were a rise of some of the powerful women, in 7th century Makkah because of this Maryam story.
Akib, I want to interrupt you, please. Sorry about that. Can you just finish very quickly in a few seconds?
Yeah,
we must finish. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you. Here I'm finished. So this was the broader significance, I think, the rationale of Quran, revealing the such story in the context of 7th century Arabia, and then after that, historically, we see some of the powerful women resonating with the faith and the critique of Maryam. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Akib. Thank you very much, Professor Saddiya. That was amazing. Beautiful hour and a half. And I must say, we're not going to allow you to just go like this. You have to come back again. We have a lot more to continue. So please think about that.
Thank you so much for being such a lovely,
month or 2 or 3
audience.
Yes, thank you so much.
And Akib, very quickly, I have to say, in our book, the Women's Khutbah book, subhanAllah, which is an incredible collection. And I'm saying this because there's 21 Muslim women, including 3 sheikhas that are here from that in that book, ranging from Senegal to Mexico to Norway to Pakistan and Indonesia. There is some, at the end of this, we have an introduction on women's spiritual leadership, khutbahs and stories. And then we have a model of 3 archetypes, and we use Khawla, Maryam, and Hajar, alayhi salatu wassalam, all of these 3 women, female archetypes. So I encourage you to look at that, because we've actually done some reflections on what it means to have archetypes and what does that imply for social ethics for here and now. But assalamu alaikum, peace and blessings be upon all of you. Thank you for your beautiful companionship, and thank you for being here. And Allahu ma'ak.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you everyone else for joining us. Thank you. Thank you. We hope to see you again. I will write to you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.